Okay, so this is going to be the quick lecture on ecology and the biosphere. A lot of this should be familiar, if not reminiscent of middle school science classes. Some of it will be a little more detailed. Okay, basically ecology is going to be the study of the environment and the organisms in it, and it's going to be based on several different factors: biology, chemistry, physics, geology. It all comes together. The main focus of ecology is going to be environmental science and addressing different environmental issues, whether that be how humans screw things up, how organisms interact with the environment. And overall, a lot of this has to do with what is known as the precautionary principle, which is basically, hey, before we put this toxic chemical into the environment, let's see how much damage it's going to do, and then maybe make a better decision. Or companies pay off the regulators and they put it in anyway and make billions of dollars and pay out money later. That's not cynical. All right, so there's many types of ecology, and this is going to be working up in a hierarchy. You can study what's known as organismal ecology, studying the organisms themselves or how they interact as a population, how those populations interact as a community. And then as you start getting into that level, then you start working in the abiotic components, such as the weather and the soil. That gives you the ecosystem approach to ecology. And then you can move up into multiple ecosystems, which is known as landscape. And then you get to the whole planet, which is known as biosphere ecology. And then as you move up from one level to the next, things get more complicated. You get new emergent properties coming out. And then you get into more intricacies with those properties. Okay, so the basic components of all ecosystems are going to be the biotic or the living components, and then the abiotic components, which include your, weather stuff, nutrients, soil, rocks, sunlight. Altogether, this makes up what is known as the biogeography, the living and the non-living. And the biogeography is then going to influence whether or not a certain species is going to occupy a certain environment. So biogeography can be a way to look at why or why not an organism is in a particular location. You can use this little chart if you want to pause and look at that and kind of work through the different factors that affect why a certain species might be in a certain location. Some of the major things affecting biogeography are going to be how organisms are dispersed, whether they are kind of clumped together, whether they are spread far apart, how they get to different places. We'll talk about this more in detail when we talk about population. But all of these things affect what's known as the natural range of an organism and where they normally live. You can also have the influence of non-native species or exotic species, which get to new environments by one mechanism or another. One common way is because, guess, humans. And so we transfer things around, like this is a really pretty plant. It's going to be really good for soil retention. Let's plant it in the south. And then it grows and it takes over everything. And that's why we have kudzu. Another thing that affects biogeography is the behavior of the organism and why they choose those particular habitats. Based on temperature or sunlight or available resources. And then you have their interactions with other species, which include mutualism, competition, predator-prey relationships, which we'll talk about later as well. Other things that affect are going to be your abiotic factors, such as the temperature, the water, the availability of the sunlight. So temperature is important for enzymes. Everything has its threshold. Water is necessary for everything. Sunlight is going to be the base of your trophic levels. So the amount of water and sunlight are going to be very important for determining what kind of plants live there. The two most important things for plants are going to be the temperature and the water, or the temperature and the precipitation. And then those two things, they determine the plants, and then the plants determine the animals. and that's the basis of your ecosystem trophic structure. Wind affects things as well. So in this picture, you see a tree that has undergone flagging. So this tree is living in a condition where there is constant wind, which is causing it to grow in a particular direction. On much higher mountains, the trees will actually just grow right across the surface of the ground because of the high winds. But winds are also important because they distribute seeds and small animals. They dry things out, and they move moisture around, and you get the weather patterns due to the wind. Rock and soil, important. That's the base of your nutrients for your plants. Rocks are going to give us things like phosphate and sulfate. And then the soils are going to hold decayed nutrients from dead plants and animals, and then they're also going to hold water, and then based on how well the water goes through the soil, the chemical nature of the soil, its pH, that's going to affect your plant populations. Your overall climate or your weather patterns, that will determine which kind of organisms can survive and determine your basic ecosystem structure. That's going to be your temperature, your water, your sunlight, and your wind. And then that's going to affect everything. So your factors affecting climate, sunlight. So you've got the sun shining, night, day, going around the planet, going around the solar system. The main things that are going to determine the amount of sunlight will be your latitude, and then the current tilt of the Earth's axis in space. So when we look at latitude, when you are on the equator, the sun is more directly shining, so it is more intense. As you go north or south from the equator, the sunlight is actually spreading out because of the curvature of the Earth, so it becomes less intense. And we can also see that in the upper latitudes, the sun is going through more of the atmosphere, so it's getting scattered more by the gases, lowering the intensity. The climate is also going to be affected by what's known as global air circulation, and what happens here is when you have moist air near the ground, that gets heated up. The heat causes that to rise, and then as it goes up, it's going to cool, and then that's going to have all kinds of precipitation. And then the cool, dry air is going to come down and hit the planet and dry out the planet. And so you're going to get these alternating patterns of warm and wet to dry to wet to dry as you move in away from the equator. So where the air descends, you get deserts. Where it rises, you get rainfall, and you get this basic pattern. So you're beginning at the tropics, warm, moist air rises, the water vapor condenses to give you precipitation, and then that dry air comes down, and you see that dries out those areas. So about every 30 degrees in latitude, you get the alternation of wet to dry to wet to dry, going both north and south. And then you can see that our poles, the Arctic and the Antarctic, are considered deserts because of the amount of precipitation that they get. But this is important because this is how our major deserts get created. This is how we get the tropical areas and the wet areas, which then drive which kind of plant species and then which kind of animal species can live in a particular environment. Water is going to be important. We know that water has a high specific heat to absorb heat and to release heat. And because of that, large bodies of water can help regulate the climate. One of the main things that happens is the formation of the ocean currents. And we see here that you've got a warm ocean current flowing up past England, and then that ocean current cools and comes back down past the United States. So what happens if you look at the climates of England and New England, so England, much higher in latitude than New England, has a milder climate because of this warm ocean current. The ocean temperatures in Maine, in northern United States during July in the peak of summer is about 56 degrees Fahrenheit. And that is because of this cold ocean current. That's actually beneficial because cold water holds more oxygen, so that can actually promote more productivity in the animals there. Water can also affect the way that the oceans or large bodies of water heat and cool the land they're next to. So here we see cool air coming across, and as that moves, that removes the heat from the land, and that cycles back. And then this is because of the ocean absorbing and releasing releasing the heat. So this helps regulate the climate on this land. So this would be, say, in the summer, this helps cool the land, and then in the winter, the heat from the ocean actually goes across and helps keep the land warmer. So this is why in places like Southern California, the climate is nice and mild, but in the Midwest, in areas where there is no large body of water, you've got very, very hot summers and very, very cold winters because you do not have this regulatory mechanism of the large body of water releasing and absorbing heat. Okay, so mountains are also going to affect your climate. We know that as you go up a mountain, it gets colder and windier, about 6 degrees for every 1,000 meters you go up in altitude. That is the equivalent of about 880 kilometers away from the equator. So you get a pretty large change for a very small distance, and so that is going to drastically affect your climate. So in very, very tall mountains, it can actually be a tropical region at the bottom, but an Arctic region at the top. And as you progress up the mountain, you actually progress through all the different kinds of biomes, from tropicals to like a deciduous forest, to the tundra, and then to the Arctic. So the altitude can be very, very impactful on your climate. If you are in the northern hemisphere, the southern side will receive more sun. And then you will also have what's known as the windward side and the leeward side. So here's your mountain. This is the wind. That's the windward side, this side, and then the leeward side is where the way that the wind comes down. This is important because as the wind hits a very high mountain, the air goes up, the air cools, and you get all the precipitation dropping. And then as the wind goes over the mountain, the air is now dry, and on the other side of the mountain you get a desert. This is what's known as a rain shadow, where you get all of your rain basically on one side of the mountain, and then you get your desert here. So this is what happens out west with the Rocky Mountains. Low mountains, this doesn't happen because there's not a high enough altitude change. But when you have a very tall mountain, then you can get a major desert on the leeward side because the moisture has dropped on the windward side. We also have the seasons. If you don't live on the equator, so this is what's known as seasonality. This is due to the Earth's axis being at a 23.5 degree angle. Please make sure you know that. And so as we are tilted away, the angle of the sun is even less, so we get less intense solar power, so that it is colder. And then as we are tilted towards it, the intensity and the focus of the sun is greater, so it is warmer. So what we see here in the summer, the northern hemisphere is tilted towards the sun. In the winter, the northern hemisphere is tilted away. And then it's opposite for the southern hemisphere. So that means Christmas in Australia is in the summer, which usually is like, wait, how can that happen? Because it does. Interestingly, in the summer, when we are tilted towards the sun, we are actually the farthest distance from the sun, and we are actually closest to the sun at the equinoxes when the day and the night are the same length. And so it's not the distance we're from the sun, but it's the angle facing. If we were straight up and down, we would not have any seasons, just like the equator. All right, so in lakes, we are going to have some seasonal changes. And basically, this is focusing on a process called turnover, which happens because the layers of the lake will become thermally stratified, where you have different layers of different temperatures of water. So if we look at this picture, we are going to see that in the winter, we get all of these different layers based on the density of water, which is determined by the temperature. So water is densest at 4 degrees Celsius. And so that water sinks to the bottom, and then we get some ice, and you get these different layers. That's the thermal stratification. In the spring, when all the water is the same temperature and therefore the same density, you get this mixing process. And that mixing process is going to be important because it brings oxygen to the bottom of the lake and brings nutrients from decomposition to the top. So when that happens, that allows oxygen to drive the decomposition further, and then these nutrients coming to the top, that's going to drive primary productivity. Then we get to the summer, warmer water at the top, less dense. We get this colder water at the bottom, more thermal stratification, and we also have this thing called a thermocline, which is the barrier between the warm and the cold. So if you've ever been in a lake and you've kind of dove down and then you hit this kind of sudden wall of cold water, that's the thermocline. That's going to stay that way, so then you'll get lots of productivity because it's warm and sunny. And then in the fall or the autumn, you get that turnover again, bringing more oxygen to the bottom for the decomposers. So then over time, this helps keep the nutrients cycling in the lake, and it keeps oxygen brought down for the decomposers in what's known as the benthic zone. So this is all of that in words. All right, we also have microclimates, which are just small protected areas where organisms will cluster because they're slightly more favorable. So for example, on Sunday, I was looking for roly-polies, little isopods, for our behavioral biology lab. And so I was not just walking around looking for them, I was turning over rocks, I was looking under potted plants, because that is a protected, moisture-rich area that they like to habitat. So that's a microclimate. All the variations in the climate, they're going to give you our different biomes. Biomes are simply the different types of ecosystems. So you've got aquatic and terrestrial ones. Your aquatic biomes have several things that are going to be in common. You've got your freshwater ones, less than 1% salt, marine 3% salt. That is 75% of the Earth's surface and responsible for the most productivity because of its size. So our basic common things in all aquatic biomes, you have the photic zone for photosynthesis, the aphotic zone where there's not enough light for photosynthesis. Then you have the bottom region, which is your benthic zone. That can be in the photic or the aphotic. If it's in the deep, deep part, that's called the abyssal zone. Then you have the open part, that's called the pelagic zone. And then you have that thermocline again. So your pelagic zone in the lake is here, that's called the limnetic zone. In the oceanic zone or the pelagic zone, it's out there. So it's basically where the photic zone and the benthic zone stop interacting. All right, types of aquatic biomes. You've got lakes. They are different than ponds because lakes are deeper. You've got clean, clear lakes that don't have a lot of nutrients in them. Those are oligotrophic. Oligo means few, so few nutrients. Then you've got the eutrophic lakes, which are nutrient rich, so there's lots of algae and gross stuff, slimy water. And going from an oligotrophic to a eutrophic lake, that is because of the influx of nutrients that can be natural over time, or that can be cultural eutrophication due to the influx of fertilizer or cow poop or manure from farms or whatever. And that is the process of eutrophication. As the process goes from oligo to U, then that is called a mesotrophic lake in between. And then this influx of nutrients eventually can cause the health of the lake to decline because there's too much algae, which is dying, causing the oxygen levels to drop, which we talked about only like 6 or so months ago. All right, nice clean lake, oligotrophic, lots of nutrients, trophic lake. Wetlands, so swamps and marshes, these are important because they've got lots of biodiversity. They help regulate and clean water, and they are where Scooby-Doo likes to solve mysteries. Streams and rivers, flowing water streams have a higher oxygen content because they flow faster. They tend to be colder, so colder, more oxygen-rich streams, you're going to have different species living there than in the slower, warmer, oxygen low rivers. So your species will be different based on oxygen and temperature. Estuaries are where the rivers meet the sea, so you've got fresh water flowing into salt water, so you get a mix, and that is called brackish water. And that will actually change with the tide. So when the tide is going out, the estuary will be more fresh water. As the tide is coming in, it will be more salt water. So the organisms that live there have to be adapted to those daily changes in salinity. And these are very, very productive. And there are also places where people like to build resorts and reduce the biodiversity. Intertidal zones or tide pools, this is where you have a small microbiome in a little rock depression, and then as the tide goes out, the water stays in place, and you get these organisms that have to be highly adapted to multiple changes every day, changes in temperature, changes in salinity, oxygen content, and then the crashing of the waves. So those are some pretty tough organisms. Then you've got the open ocean, biggest productivity based on size, smallest productivity based on per square meter, but it's huge, so lots of stuff happens. Coral reefs, tropical rainforests, go watch Finding Nemo, consider it homework. Marine benthic zone, this is the deep bottom portion near the thermal vents where you could potentially have had that prebiotic evolution process starting, and now you have chemosynthesizers that use the heat and the chemicals as your base of your food chain down there. The other source of nutrients and food is the dead stuff that floats to the bottom that things will live on. If you want to watch some very weird videos, look up marine benthic animals, and you'll be a little creeped out because they're super weird because the pressure down there is so high, there's no light. They are not about looking attractive. All right, so our terrestrial biomes, these are going to be the ones that you should be pretty familiar with from previous educational experiences. We can look at the temperature and the rainfall of a biome on a chart called a climograph, a graph of the climate, and you can kind of figure out what kind of biome it's going to be. Where the biomes overlap is known as an ecotone because we do not have a distinct transition between biomes. You have this slow gradation, and that slow gradation is an ecotone. So this is a climograph, so we can see lots of precipitation, warm tropical rainforest. Not a lot of precipitation, warm desert. That's how a climograph works. And these overlapping areas right here, those are the ecotones where you have that transition between the different types of biomes. Basic types, periodic disturbances can be important for our biomes. Some of them are going to be fire dependent, where the plant life has adapted to those fires and actually needs the fire to reproduce. So you're going to have things like certain pine trees need the smoke from a fire for the pine cones to open, for the seeds to drop out. And that is a benefit to those pine trees because the fire has just wiped out all the underbrush. Then a few days later, the pine cone opens, the seeds fall out. Now there's no competition, and the seedlings have a good start without competition for sunlight. Basics: tropical rainforest, super productive, huge amount of biodiversity, large capacity for us to find new medications, or we can cut it all down for grazing land for beef. Kind of a bad idea, because these are the lungs of our planet that draw in a huge amount of carbon dioxide, produce a huge amount of oxygen. But ironically, even though they are super productive, the soil is very nutrient poor because all of that plant life is constantly sucking those nutrients out. And also interesting, every day there's a sandstorm in the Sahara which carries particles across the ocean that comes down in the precipitation on the tropical rainforest, and that water contains phosphate from an old ancient lake, and that's how the tropical rainforest gets fertilized, from the dead stuff in the Sahara Desert. Deserts: hot, dry, unless it's an Arctic desert, then it's cold and dry. Savannas are grasslands with trees, so think Lion King. Very, very, very productive. Supports a huge amount of wildlife. So if you've ever seen a nature documentary with all the zebras and the wildebeests and the baby antelope getting chased by the lion, nature. We also have what's known as a chaparral. So this is Southern California, the Mediterranean, mild climates. They can be hot, they can be cold, it depends. But these are all pretty dry. So all of your plants are going to have thick, waxy cuticles to be modified for that dry condition. Grasslands, we can see here, Midwest here, so huge, beautifully rich soil, great for farming. So these are the bread baskets of the planet where the majority of food is actually produced. And they have lots of grass in them. Coniferous forest, lots of pine trees. These are actually important because they actually produce a lot of oxygen because they're so big, but they're cold, so the plant life has to be adapted for that cold, so that's why the leaves are tiny little needles. Then we have the temperate broadleaf forest, which is where we are right now, so consider it homework and go for a walk. And then we have the tundra, which is up north, and you still have plant life, but it's very small. You don't have trees because it's too cold. And so the main vegetation is actually lichen, which is a symbiosis between fungus and algae. And then this is marked specifically by something known as permafrost. So when you go down about 1 meter, that's the only part that is going to thaw out every year, and everything else is permanently frozen. So you have the permafrost. And one of the concerns with global warming is that the permafrost is going to start to melt. And studies have shown that there is a huge amount of methane stored in the permafrost. And if the permafrost melts, the methane will come out. Methane is a very, very potent greenhouse gas. So then you'll have more greenhouse gases, which will drive even faster climate change. So then you get into that positive feedback loop of increased rapid temperature change. And I think that is it.